Strand. Welcome to our Downton Abbey evening. Tonight we're going to have Jessica Fellowes, the author of the Chronicles of Downton Abbey, which is the new book, and also the World of Downton Abbey, which we also have available if you want to flip through that one as well. And Carol Wallace, who is an author of To Marry an English Lord, which is the book that the show was based on. So what we're going to do, they're going to talk with each other for a bit, and then you will be excited to know that we will be able to ask questions and give comments and just have a free, lovely discussion of the show and of the books. And please join me in welcoming our two authors.
So, Kate, you warned me about... I have to... Okay, never mind. We got warnings about the technical matters. I've been really excited about this for a while now, and I have all kinds of questions for Jessica, which we probably won't even get to half of them. But the thing that's been sort of running through my mind as I thought about talking to you in particular is the way, I think in seasons 1 and 2, I haven't seen season 3, but the way this series deals with shifts and balance of power as this sort of ongoing and underlying kind of pedal point. And then I thought, well, that's stupid because every narrative does that. But then, you know, they don't, actually. I mean, Mary Poppins is not about the balance of power. So I guess I'm curious as to whether this is... Do you think this is always? I thought about Gosford Park then, and then I thought about Julian's novels. Is this always, is it a preoccupation for him, or is Downton special in this way?
I think it is, it's sort of a preoccupation of his, but also the point about Downton Abbey and that period is that it's looking at the change in power. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that period that I like, particularly in the 20th century, early 20th century, is that it started very clearly, the power lay with the aristocracy and with the big houses. And by just 20 years later, that was really beginning to change. And we had seen shifts, happen towards the end of the 19th century, and the aristocracy were getting undermined in various ways, and the working classes were getting sort of braver and more vocal about what they wanted and changes and things. But the war then escalated these things, hugely. And by 1920, suddenly, it's beginning to look very different. I mean, in fact, they all thought that the revolution was going to come and all these monarchies were collapsing everywhere, and Russia was, sort of, royal family had gone, the Greeks had gone, the Spanish had gone, the French had gone. They were all sure that England would be next. And in fact, it didn't happen. The royal family strengthened, if anything, and the old way of life with those big houses didn't really go until the Second World War. But Julian saw all those shifts happen in his youth, and I think he found that very interesting. And his father, my grandfather, was born of a family that his father was killed in the First World War, and his mother was sort of not particularly grand, I don't think, but her husband had been quite. And so my grandfather was shipped around, this rather sort of lost cousin amongst very grand aunts who were determined that he should marry incredibly well and things. And he in their eyes, he didn't. In our eyes, he did. He married my grandmother, who I adored and was very beautiful, and but she was middle class. She wasn't an aristocrat. And so he saw all these things kind of going on. And then you had the 60s, which he was a young man at, and he was a debutant and doing all this crazy season thing and, sort of lords and ladies and all the rest of it. And meanwhile, on the other side of it, his brother, my father, was the hippie saying, all that way of life is completely over, and in a few years' time, we're all just going to be lying on a beach smoking dope, and all this stuff about, titles is just over, and, and neither kind of thing ever quite happened. As it is, the world muddles on in its own particular way and is a bit different to what it was before, but it takes a long, long time for great shifts. So I think there's an understandable preoccupation with Julian, if you like. But I think what's interesting, what he's done with Downton Abbey, is he's created this little microcosm of all of that happening. And we see with the below stairs, we see how the sort of attitudes and aspirations of the working classes are changing. And above stairs, we see how the expectations and the weight of responsibility is changing. And, slowly.
But I think also, even on the micro level, in the relationships among the family members and the relationships among the servant structure, there's a constant kind of seesawing. For example, in one episode, Thomas will be triumphant, and then he sort of comes to ruin, and then you see Daisy's star kind of struggling to rise, and even with the sisters, certainly that is, the three of those girls, that is certainly a power struggle among them.
But I think we all feel a bit like that. I mean, I have, years where it all feels like it's going my way, and years where it feels, very, very difficult. And, Julian certainly had that as well. I think also the point about Julian's characters and why we find Downton Abbey interesting, and it's got a bit of a soap opera pace to it sometimes, but then the characters are more interesting than that, is because he isn't black and white about the way he portrays them. And he makes, Hugh Bonville said that he actually talked to Julian about this and asked, where Julian was coming from with his characters, and Julian said he always begins with the fundamental belief that people are good, and that some are, taken off that path, strayed. No one is born, he doesn't believe they're born evil or blank slate or whatever. And that's where he's sort of starting with his characters. So they do the wrong thing sometimes, but there should be an explanation for it somewhere.
Which you do see, I think, and particularly even the evil O'Brien softens and then goes back to her evil ways.
But you see her sometimes, look. I mean, she was very sweet about the shell-shocked valet who.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Mosley, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Who reminded her of her brother, and you thought there's something, that went on there. And I mean, she has got a sort of madness, and Julian did say that about her, and that after she realises that she nearly killed Cora, she sort of turns that madness in on itself, and instead of being out to get her, it's about to protect her. But it's the same level of kind of extremity. She's based on a real lady's maid that Julian knew of, who was the lady's maid to his grandfather's cousin or something, and he said she was as polite as a courtier, but manipulative and black of heart underneath, and apparently drove away all of her mistress's family and friends until she ruled their Knightsbridge house alone. And the mistress died, believing that everybody had betrayed her trust apart from her one most loyal servant. So that was their part. And ladies' maids in that time often were quite tricky. They were in that very funny position of being, so near the top of the tree, being very privy to a lot of intimate secrets, and also the ear of everyone downstairs, and yet it wasn't their own life to lead.
No, they really are neither fish nor fowl. Yeah. I was very curious about how what the process is for writing these books, because the timing, I don't get it. I don't get when you start. Do you sleep? I don't understand how this works.
No, I mean, somebody said to me, how do you do it? I've got a small boy as well. When I started the first book, The World of Downton Abbey, he was 4.5 months old. And somebody at the end said, how do you do it? And I said, because I'm mentally ill. I just couldn't really think of another explanation. But we did start them quite late, actually, because the first book, I was brought into discussions with the publishers after the first series had finished in the UK. So December 2010. Is that right? Yeah. And where are we now? 2012. Well, yeah, December 2010, and then I didn't start till January, and they gave me this deadline originally of the 1st of April, and I said, don't be mad. But what I ended up having to do was doing it, kind of feeding it to them a bit in chapters. So there was such a lot of design work, and also we were still photographing the series as it was being filmed. So it was quite a kind of jigsaw puzzle at the end to put it all together. I mean, I finished the first draft by the end of May, and then it went through edits and checks, and it went on quite a bit actually. It was at the printers by July. it's this mad thing in printing, which I don't know if you know, but always makes me laugh so much, that the reason the deadlines are so tight is because everything has to be shipped. So everything, email, blog, tweet, everything's done really, really, really fast, and then slow boat to China, to wait for the books. But that's the only, the reason it has to be done so fast. But this week, the Chronicles I wrote in about 10 weeks. The research had been, a lot of the research had been done for me. And actually it was a really nice, smooth process, because I felt really familiar with the territory now. I kind of knew what I wanted to do. It was a much more personal analysis. The World of Downton Abbey looked at the big themes that we see drawn out by series 1 and 2, the First World War and social change, how to run an estate, that kind of thing. And then for the second book, we wanted to be much more led by the characters. So each chapter is 1 or 2 characters, and looking at who they really are, what I think of them, looking at their backstories and how they've got to that point, and what Julian's idea of them was, what the actors were, and then how production bring them to life through props, through their costume, and then looking at the bit that for me was really, really interesting, is looking at the real life counterparts. And so you should have a real sense of, with Anna, what newspaper stories she was reading, what she would have in her pocket, what kind of uniform she's wearing, what Bates had in prison, what Matthew took to war with him, that kind of thing. So it should make it begin to feel really, really real.
Well, I think it really does. One thing that I really liked, the map, the big map of Downton Abbey that shows the estate. That's in this book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is wonderful, because you get a sense of this big agricultural estate, and you get a sense of how much of it is given over to parkland, which is just private for the family to use, I assume. So I'm very curious about the economics. I don't quite understand still how they make any money from the estate.
Well, this is something that they're going to have to begin to face in series 3, as did all the families then. It was becoming a serious issue. There was an agricultural depression in the 1880s, and then taxes began to increase, and then the First World War massively increased taxes. So it used to be sort of all right, because you could kind of get by. You didn't sort of need terribly much money in a way. You sort of farmed it out. You had your tenant farmers. The land was working itself through. Servants didn't cost very much money. There was money sort of sitting around and earning interest in things, and they all started to disappear. And the economics didn't really work. It's amazing looking at some of the. I've found some sort of wonderful stories of people going back to their estates after the war and realising that there was nothing, and sometimes being robbed by the accountants who'd been managing the land for them. And they didn't really understand, and they didn't have proper business brains. If you run a country estate in England now, you've got to have a proper business brain, or at least employ someone who does, or you haven't got a hope of making it work. And they virtually all have been opened up in some way. Highclere Castle, where Downton Abbey is filmed, is a private house, essentially, but the owners don't live in it. They live in a cottage on the grounds, and they invite people to hire it, and as much, the film company has it now 6 months a year, and then everybody else has it the remaining 6 months of the year, and they kind of go there for Christmas and the odd shooting party. So that's that's the only way to do it. So it's a good question how the economics work, because they didn't really, for the most part.
But even in theory, there's enough capital coming down, the famous entail. There's enough capital coming down to keep the whole thing afloat, and then the tenant farms. Is that a break-even kind of?
I suppose that must have been. You'd have to ask someone better than me. But as you know, a lot of these families looked to American heiresses to come over and rescue them, and that was where the capital came from. Those women came, they married into an estate, and they did rescue it. We still feel the effects of Consuelo Vanderbilt's wealth. Because you married into the family, and then that was the end of your money.
Well, that's Kabbalah money. But in fact, there are still families, and I know who some of them are, and so do you, who are still afloat on the American dollars, and if they've been properly invested. And we are talking vast sums.
Awesome. And Consuelo Vanderbilt, I can't remember, but she came with something that was something like $12 million then.
Something like that. Railway stock, which they probably still hold in some of it anyway.
Probably.
Yeah. New York Central. Yeah. So that, I suppose, in some cases that would. But then on the other hand, there's some of those American families, the money wasn't really there, or as I guess depends on how it was invested.
It depends on how it was invested.
We're going to be finding out.
Yeah.
So to back away for a little to a less serious question, have you seen those quizzes about which character you are in Downton Abbey?
Oh, it's a multiple choice kind of.
Yes. Did you take it?
Oh no, don't know
you
if I
haven't taken it? Oh my gosh! So we don't get to ask her which character she is.
Which am I?
Yes, because you do a multiple choice thing, and you could in fact be lurking around and being.
I don't know. I think I'd probably have to say I'm someone upstairs.
But you see, it's about character. It's about character. You could actually be O'Brien and not know it, but we know that you're actually she isn't. We know that.
I could be telling you anything.
No,
my favourite character, I don't know if I'm like her, is Lady Edith.
I would have said not off the top of my head, but Are you a middle sister?
No, I'm an elder sister. I'm probably the most like Mary, really. But except that, I don't know. Lady Edith is the one that, even Julian is a bit mean about her. When I asked about them all for the first book, he said the point about the three daughters, the point that he's illustrating, if you like, is that they all want power, but they go about it in different ways. Mm-hmm. And Mary is happy to kind of try and get it the old-fashioned way, through marriage, and Lady Sybil is very forward-thinking. She wants it the modern way, but Edith just wants anything she can get. So, poor Edith. But I think she's really interesting because she represents a lot of women at that time. They had something which they called the problem of surplus women in 1920, which was, there were so many more women than men. They did a census in 1921 and they realised there were 1.6 million more women than men. A bit more than that, I think, near 1.7 million, and then there were 1.6 million men who had come back from the war injured. So, there's another whole lot, 1.5 million, who may not be able to work or marry or, whatever, for whatever reason. So it's a lot of women. And there were editorials in the papers sort of suggesting that these women were shipped to the colonies in order to kind of, like they used to do with the convicts in Australia, what to do. And it's great period to read about because you get these fantastic letters to the paper by women saying, don't be so rude, it's such an insult. We don't all want to get married. And actually it was a great moment of freedom for a lot of women. They were freed from the potential tyranny of marriage, not because they might have married tyrants, but because if you married then, that it gave you some kind of independence in that it got you away from your family house and you were running a house of your own. But then that was what you were doing. You were going and running a house. You were bringing up children. You were looking after your husband or whatever, unless you were with someone particularly enlightened. But now, without that, you had these women who were going off. They could go and get degrees for the first time. They could work in science. They'd been nurses in the war. They could develop that further. They could be journalists. They were beginning to get flats in London. So their expectations, so you look at someone like Edith, the life that she thought she was going to have in the 1910s. She was just going to, do the season, find a husband, get married, live in a big house, do the odd charity lunch, and that was sort of going to be it. And suddenly, anything was possible. And some people liked that, and some people didn't. But I feel like she's the one to possibly watch, I think.
Well, she does in season 2 at least. She does quite well with the tractor, and she sort of takes things into her hands.
She kind of finds a voice then, and also she's not. Although she has fairly sort of dodgy love affairs, they're not entirely unrequited. She had her farmer.
Yeah, that's right.
The farmer.
Yeah.
He was married, but she's doing something. It wasn't like nothing was happening at all.
Nor was she mucking around with guys who drop dead on her bed. So there's that too. One of the things that has puzzled me about the show, which I adore, but so does my husband. Men like this show as much as women do, and I still don't quite understand why that is.
Maybe because they get to join in the conversation, I think, well, it's difficult to say. I mean, at most events that I go to, I'm always sort of still a bit surprised when there are men there. I still kind of think it's a woman's, it's a woman's thing.
I'm looking out.
We can count a few. We can count a few in our number. I think it does. Well, it's got very good balance of male and female characters, So, and I think one of the attractions of the show is that there's such a wide range of characters that there's going to be someone that you can latch onto or recognise, or and I think a lot of men I think Robert is somebody that a lot of men feel sympathetic with. I mean, my husband feels sympathetic with him, and he's constantly sort of being slightly ganged up on, and sort of feeling a bit sort of useless and not quite sure what his way is in the world, and that it was a real issue for men at that time. But I mean, women were, fighting for independence, and men were, a lot of the time, you can sense this sort of fear that they were just going to get edged out completely if women were allowed to carry on on this track. That equality wasn't going to be the answer. It was going to be about shoving them out of the way altogether. And I think we saw that with Robert during the First World War. He lost his sense of, it had been all very clear to him when he was growing up. He was just going to be the Earl, he was going to walk around the estate, he was going to tell everyone what to do, and everyone would say, oh my goodness, you're the Earl, can I come and kiss your boots? And suddenly that kind of era was all over. The aristocracy weren't as respected as they used to be. His word was not law, and all these women started telling him how the house was going to be used and what they were going to be doing in it. And he couldn't go to war. He couldn't do the one thing he knew. He didn't really have a job, as it were. And all these people like Matthew, who kind of came in and at first, he could be a bit snidey about the fact they had jobs and things. Actually, it turned out that was actually an incredibly useful thing to be doing, and his way was wrong. And that was Julian's explanation for why Robert has his little dalliance with the maid, which lots of people were, kind of really didn't like. But it was about the fact that Robert just had kind of lost his sense of who he was and what to do. And he sort of, Julian said at one point, well, Cora abandoned him. So it was not really a good enough excuse, but
well, and that's, in what way did she abandon him?
Well, because she got very busy with the
hospital,
and things. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. You do make the point, which I thought was an excellent one, about Robert's skills and how how Matthew's skills tend to sort of eclipse them. And I think we see that. We don't see that in season 2 so much, but is that something that we're going to see more of in season 3?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, because it became increasingly obvious that the people who were going to win in the world were the ones who had skills, and you could no longer just rely on the fact that you were well born or had a country house and things. All those things still helped. To a degree, they still help. You can't really get away from the fact that somebody who's been born into a good position still carries with them a natural arrogance and confidence that takes them quite far in the world. But you also need skills if you're really going to develop that into something proper. And that was beginning to become clear then. And it was interesting. I think it's a really good look at that world, in that Matthew arrives and everyone thinks, oh my, he just can't fit, he's so out of place, he just can't fit in anywhere. And not very much longer, everyone's sort of listening to him as he says, I think things really ought to be a bit simpler, we don't have to do it the way it's always been done. And the big divide at that time, I think, really was between those who wanted change and those who didn't. That was the major divide. It wasn't really class or money or all of those things still created their own differences, but those who were willing to really take the opportunities that were coming their way and run with them could really go very far with that. And then there were others who just were resisting, can we not just get back to the way the world was? And then they realised they couldn't. I think in lots of ways there's a real parallel with now, in that with all the technical changes that we are sort of scrabbling slightly to adapt to, and we don't yet really know quite how we're going to really make this work. A lot of our business models don't really fit our daily lives. That it's a bit kind of overwhelming, the constant communication. But if anybody said we've just got to go back to the way it was before, you can't. I mean, life in 2000. We just couldn't go back to communicating in that way anymore. We're stuck with it, so we've got to find a way of making it work for us. And I think they felt like that. I mean, someone like Violet was looking at the world. I mean, she could never have seen, when she was a young girl, that there would be people flying in planes, there would be tanks in the war, there would be telephones, electric lights,
How old is she? When was she born, do you know?
Well, I think she's meant to be sort of 70-ish, yeah.
So born in the 1850s then.
Yeah.
So she has seen just
she sees
frightening amount of change.
She sees it all come in. And I always remember being told that my great-grandmother had seen her first car only when she was 12 years old.
Wow.
That's like my great-grandmother. That's not that,
No,
that's not that long ago. That's not that long ago.
Well, so I'm worried about Robert. I have a real soft spot for him. I'll just come out and tell you right now. When I took the test, I was Robert, so conscientious, And I'm worried that he's going to be the fuddy-duddy. I'm worried that he's going to be the rear guard guy, kind of scrabbling to hang on to things the way they were. He and Carson kind of, trying to keep their fingers in the dike. Can you reassure me? Maybe not.
I don't know. I think
I don't want him to look silly. That's the thing.
No, he's never silly. The thing about Robert is that he's very much based on my grandfather, who was someone who had a kind of an incredibly strong sense of moral duty. And my father said about his father that if he crashed a plane in the desert and there was a parking meter there, he would worry if he couldn't find the right change. Yeah, and that's sort of Robert. But there's also this other sort of slightly odd thing about them where they neither did they believe that they could really affect change. I mean, my grandfather believed that if God wanted you to be rich, he would have arranged for you to inherit money. And he didn't inherit that money himself, so therefore he was never really going to be rich. I mean, he even thought sort of interior decoration was a sort of act of God. Whenever my grandmother would suggest maybe changing things, so I think Robert's problem is that he sort of wants to listen. He is all those things. He's conscientious and he's kind, but he doesn't really understand why you would go about changing things. I mean, Catholicism, his religion is a good example of that. Like my grandfather, interestingly, he was Catholic, but he was converted at the age of 12. Only because his mother married a sort of very serious Catholic, and the aunts apparently thought this was the equivalent of my grandfather being sold into slavery. I mean, Catholicism was just this horrendous thing. But anyway, that was my grandfather's thing, and he grew up with that, and he just thought anyone who would change it, why would you do that? Why would you do that? That's the club you're in. Stay there. So yeah, I'm not sure if that really reassures you or not, but that's kind of Robert's position.
I'm not sure I knew that they were Catholic. Chapel, I don't know.
No, they're not. Robert's not Catholic. No. But,
I see.
But there will be, but there are issues, yeah.
To go back to the frivolous, do you have a favorite costume?
Well, I can't speak. The costumes in the third series, for me, were just particularly ravishing. I know that the costume designer had a brief, which I thought was a rather clever one, at the very beginning of the first series, which was that it had to be completely authentic, but also things that we would quite enjoy wearing now. So
that is very clever. Because we're all shopping while we're watching TV, sort of. So
they kind of, so they were very kind of conscious about the kind of colours that they chose and the way that they used the details and things, and everything is beautifully resourced. The mixture of hire costumes or things that have been made up but using or vintage materials, or they've sourced. I mean, it's incredible. That's why I'm so happy for them really with the book, because these moments would be gone on screen, but in the books they really get preserved, so you really get to see them. This sort of tiny bit of Spanish.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Victorian
and both of the books have that. Though I think the earlier one perhaps a little more. There's more costume porn in the earlier book. I think.
More costume
and it's
porn
really good.
But I mean, I love for the series 3. three that you've got coming up, Cora's clothes for me were really kind of wonderful, because we're going into the 1920s, and there's quite a lot of 1920s stuff that we all quite like now, and they really do put in. The other thing that the costume designer said they were asked to do was to make sure, in the dining room scenes, to make sure that the women all looked very attractive. So there's lots of sort of shimmer and sequin, and I rather love. I mean, Violet's is obviously the most old-fashioned, but she has these rather kind of wonderful sort of grand
that
purples
lace
and,
coat,
yeah.
And she's always sparkling away. Tell me, in the book I was completely fascinated by the food part. Can you tell us a little bit about that? This is the food is real. All the food is real.
The food is real. The food is real. In fact, it's so real that they don't really want to eat it, because when you're filming a dining room scene that lasts 12 hours, the last thing you want to be doing. Dan Stevens said to me, he learnt early on that if he was going to be chewing a bit of chicken in that scene, 12 hours later he chewed 40 bits of chicken that were now very cold and congealed. So you'll notice when you watch those dining room scenes that nobody eats. It's just
which would be true downstairs as well. Clearly, no one. It's the same thing, only their food is less pretty.
Yeah, but it's completely real, and it was and it's quite a challenge for them, because you're filming all day. Apparently in the third series they had a bit of a problem with some lobster on a hot day that just got worse and worse and worse, and kind of smelled absolutely revolting by the end. But also there's a continuity issue, because the dining room scenes are filmed in Highclere Castle, which is a real house, and 2 hours down the road in Ealing Studios, the set has been built for below stairs, because below stairs no longer really exist in those houses anymore. So that basically what you have is the footman leaving the kitchen and then arriving in the dining room 2 weeks later. So you have to make sure that all matches.
The other thing that I was struck by is some of the photographs of people filming wearing. It looks so cold. Looks as if they were just freezing.
It is cold, but it is cold. I mean, Highclere is set on the top of a hill, so on anybody else's warm day it's cold, and on a cold day it's freezing. So I mean, the actresses actually preferred the earlier series when they had really long skirts, because then they could wear leg warmers underneath and things when they were filming outside. And they were, those things, the behind the scenes shots you always see, but as soon as the cameras are off, the puffer jackets go on.
You also mentioned in the book that Daisy gets to claim her place in the sun a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Daisy. Well, the thing about Daisy is that she's a really she's another kind of all of those characters represent something that's going on at that time, and the thing Julian told me about her, which I found really interesting, was he said that she was so much considered the lowest of the low by everybody, that the social gap between her and Carson was bigger than the gap between Carson and Lord Grantham. It was just, and they, on the very first day of filming, the actress said it was quite funny, although slightly sort of, because the historical advisor told them all to line up in hierarchical order, and there she was, right at the end. And she is quite small as well, sort of there, appearing at the bottom. But nevertheless, although for all that, she was also one of the first of the working class generation girls that were beginning to get educated properly. And the education movement had changed. So she could read and write. And then, so as she goes on, she starts to get a sense of all this change happening. Before, a girl like her would be a kitchen maid in the basement of a kitchen. She would pretty much stay there. It would be very hard. She might get to become a stillroom maid or something. You would sort of, and if you were unbelievably sort of brilliant, you might eventually become a cook. But it would take you an awfully long time. And you'd have to have a real
hierarchy.
leg up.
The kitchen hierarchy and the main servants are separate branches of it.
The kitchen, are separate. But Daisy begins to see she's sort of talking more to the other people in the servants' hall, and she sees these Hollywood magazines lying around, with these stories of people who come from nowhere and go on to glamour and riches, and she starts to read that. The other thing you got then were things like tabloid newspapers, which have much more in the way of human interest stories, and you started to get these penny novels, that they could all read, and so there was a real sort of awareness suddenly of of this world beyond the house and how life might be slightly different, and plus there were these revolutions going on. They weren't completely immune to it, so there are these these ideas are getting planted in her head. Whether she is of the mettle to really make something of that, we'll have to wait and see. But the opportunity was there.
I was struck also watching the series again to prepare for this evening. I got to watch a lot of television, which was really nice. And it is quite hermetic, at least in seasons 1 and 2. We don't get that far away from Downton. There are a couple of London scenes, but does that change in season 3? Is there
If anything, it kind of, I think the second series has got...
You've got the war.
Yeah, you've got the war and these kind of big world events going on. And the third season is about them dealing with the aftermath of that. But it is about the house. I think, Julian, it would be a mistake to take it away from the house. I mean, I think all of those series stopped working when... I mean, I loved Mad Men, but when Don kind of is going off in Florida and I'm not interested, I want to be in the office, where it's all sort of happening. So I think that that's the central context for it. It's got to stay there, really.
Yeah.
And I mean, also everyone sort of loves it when Carson is worried about whether the silver is polished enough or the pudding glasses have gone missing or something,
Well, that's a question too. I mean, to what extent is Julian now reacting to what he knows works and what he knows people like, or does he kind of...
Oh, no, he does react. He does react. I mean, he said that, what's been really fun for him with this is that he's not really written TV series before. I mean, he did a couple of children's book adaptations and things. But when you write a movie, you write your entire character's arc. You know what's going to happen to everybody. And with television, that ain't so. And he's written kind of... I mean, when I went to the read-through for the third series, and he'd written the first 5 episodes. We hadn't written the ones beyond that. And some of the actors find that quite difficult. Dan Stevens said, you don't know where your character's going. But then in life, you don't know where you're going either. So, adapt that. But he has completely responded to that. And he said, case in point, actually, was the original parts for Thomas and O'Brien were quite small. But when the actors came in, they were so good that they all said, we've got to make more of this. We've got to do more with it. So. Yeah. Also, if any of the actors are rude to Julian, then he can just...
chuck them out.
Yeah.
But of course, no one would, I'm sure, dare do that. To go back to the book for a second, what part of the process have you enjoyed most?
Well, I mean, I have to say, it's been amazing to be involved in something that's, to be on the Downton train, and something that so many people have got such goodwill towards. I used to work for a tabloid newspaper in London, and I really had to leave the job.
Just got out in time,
I was not getting any goodwill towards me at all. So that's been incredibly nice. And working with Julian has been really nice, because we've always been, we've always got on incredibly well. So that, it's been great. And we don't actually work that much on the books, but there's a little bit of events and stuff that we do together. And obviously talking to him about it all. But I mean, for me, the really great thing has been the research that I did for both books, because it was a period that I was anyway interested in. All my favourite authors have always been the 1920s authors. And it was that period that, as I was saying before, that Julian and I were drawn to, because it's our family history. I mean, it's a very real time. I think it's very real for all of us, really. But for me particularly so, I mean, watching that first series was almost, not quite watching a family video, but, I did I was thinking, will anyone else get this? It's so close, in terms of the sort of stories and things that we
discussed. Could you identify certain characters' story arcs?
Not so much that, but it was just, I knew the things that interested Julian and interested me, and I could recognise so much what he felt so very personal. So it wasn't that I could identify that's my, Aunt Sally or whatever, but it was just, that the themes were very close to home. But everyone got it, so it was great.
One of the things that you made a point about, which I thought was very interesting, it was the way the guests would sit at the dining table, and I think what you said was that maybe one of the characters said that the guests would sit there in complete comfort. Everything they need is at hand. They need not reach for anything. They need not stretch for anything. And then it suddenly occurred to me that the aristocrats are quite physically passive, at least for a good portion of that, which seems so kind of not contrary to what you'd expect of them in their position. So much of what they do in the house is sit and wait for things to be done for them or brought to them, and it just it struck me as such a contrast, maybe to the way their lives were in the greater world, but it must be difficult for the actors.
Yeah, they did find it difficult. I mean, they did have to be constantly told not to put their hands in their pockets. And Rob Collier, who plays Thomas, said, he can't bear watching the very early scenes of the first series because he would walk in a completely different way. I mean, the costumes help because everything is authentic right down to the underwear and the starched collars, and they help you sit and...
Did you try on a corset?
No. I wouldn't fit. Those actresses are so skinny. I couldn't even get a corset around my thigh. I mean, they're unbelievable. You think they're thin in real life, they're half that. It's on TV, but plus they're not at all comfortable. Although Julian was quite funny the other day. He said he had to do some TV show that required him to wear a male corset, a period thing, and he said when you first put it on, you think I'm actually going to be dead by 4:00 this afternoon and never eat again. And he said, and then weirdly you sort of get used to it, But Mrs. Patmore, who's always furious because she said, no one thinks I wear a corset, and I do. I have to sort of suffer it, all day. She found that if you lay on your back on the kitchen table, that sort of helped you a bit,
Okay. Well, and I have read women who actually missed them, and so that when they start to go out, as they do in the 20s, I believe, that these women were just really reluctant to get rid of them because then there's all this
but it's like that
on.
tight pair of trousers that you own, and when you've eaten too much, so they're quite useful. There's a good line I thought in the second series where Sybil is asking for her dresses to be taken out. Something must have gone on there. Lady Edith said, no, they don't shrink by themselves,
Yes, I did wonder about that.
Remark.
I wondered if that was a little plot line that was going to be launched.
No, it was just a kind of Julian remark.
So what do you wish that readers knew about Downton Abbey that maybe they don't know? Is there anything that that you think about that people maybe aren't aware of?
Not aware of. No, I think what I hope the books do is there are no spoilers in the book.
No spoilers.
They should enrich your viewing. That's what they're designed for. I think what I'm keen for people to understand perhaps is that there are certain people who will disagree with this view of history. It is one view of history of that way of life. But nevertheless, everything that is said of that particular view is authentic. I mean, it's hard to describe, and I think you have to think, how would this world today get described? How could you summarise a life lived now? Certain elements would get lost, certain things would be less subtle, or whatever. But I think, I think we often patronise the people of the past by assuming, well, if they lived in that position or were born in that way, they thought like this, they did that. And I hope Downton Abbey in the book helps you to understand that they were just as complicated as we are. They were as unsure of themselves as we are. Just they were doing it in different clothes, with a different set of attitudes around them. So that would be.
I think, particularly in the new book, the sense of context is so interesting. It does feel that you've been able to think sort of on a bigger scale than perhaps in the earlier book, and it does add a great deal to the context. I think. Yeah, it's great. Should we do questions to the audience? Sure. Do you want to pass this around? Or do you want to do that? Yes. Ellie thinks that we can all speak for ourselves, but maybe not. First question.
Well, thank you for doing this, first of all. Now, Dan Stevens, is he leaving the story?
I don't know.
Okay.
I would.
Well, tell him not to, because
I'll tell him not
the whole
to.
thing, isn't it?
I'll tell him not to.
Also, can I ask another question? Yeah. I know back in the day there were like few minorities in England. Are they going to introduce one into the
Julian
story?
said recently actually that he'd like to have it. He said there should be an Indian character, at least, but sadly they weren't, present enough then.
I'm going to see if I can squeeze in 2 questions. One of them is Edith. I know, and you know, I of course adore every character in every program. I mean, every episode. But I thought the mean one is the homely one. And I wonder if there's any blowback about that. It's the beautiful, good daughter and the beautiful, slightly less good daughter, and then the mean one is the homely daughter.
The homely daughter. Well, she sort of was because she didn't know her. You know, she just didn't have her position. She didn't, you know, she didn't, and that's what made her mean. You know, but I know.
I wonder.
In lots of ways, Mary is quite mean, even though she's beautiful.
Yes.
You know, so I don't think it's necessarily kind of mean equals homely equals mean or whatever. You know.
No, I wondered if there had been criticism about that. You know.
If there was, so had there been criticism about that?
Had there been criticism of
that? No. I think you know, you kind of, there's got to. He couldn't make all of them lovely. You know, we've got to have a kind of dynamic. That's, you know, a storyline dynamic there in that sense. And I think, anyway, as I say, I think what makes Edith interesting is that because things don't fall into her lap, you know, in that way, she's got to start looking for some other things to do, and that actually turns out to make her, hopefully, more interesting and more dynamic than the others.
Yes, and another quick question is that I heard that Shirley MacLaine is Mrs. Levinson.
Yes.
Is that right? So is that actually going to be introduced as, like, Mrs. Levinson, she is Jewish, and meaning the Cora is?
It's quite the Jewish thing, of course, is a big thing here, which is not particularly addressed. That she, if I remember correctly, she is not Jewish, but she married a Jewish man, and they brought their children up as Episcopalian, which was quite usual then, and there is a sort of moment where it's kind of explained, you know, as to what, as to why they did that, but not a huge thing has been made of it.
And I have a quick question. You said that people that are, got brought out into society, did the season, and got married. All right, Mary is 1912, and the Titanic sinks. It's now 1920 something, and she's still not married. How the hell did that happen? I mean, I know.
Well, that was the war. That was the war.
But there was still 3 or 4 years between when the Titanic sank and the war.
Well, she was quite young. I mean, yeah, she was quite young. Well, it looked like she almost was going to be, because she ruined it for herself, didn't she, by putting an old Kamal Pamuk in her bed.
I know, it just seemed like a very long time, and why didn't they just marry her off? Because
then it wouldn't have been so interesting as a plot line. Yeah.
Okay, but so I want to know how much was literary
the
license.
series would have ended after
how
episode 3.
How much was literary license and how much was really reality? Since none of the girls, it seemed like several years before any of the girls got married, and it would.
No, but I think there was a real issue in that, you know, we first meet her in 1912. She's just about to kind of come out then, I think, as a debutante. She's just had her season. She's not particularly successful, and then the war didn't end that. You know, if there were no young men around, there was no season. They were all quite a bit older. By the end of that, of course, there were marriages going on and things, you know. But at her level, was she expected to marry a duke or something? And then, of course, she had the scandal that she knew was there and it was out there. That suddenly reduced her chances considerably. So her options weren't great. We look and we think, well, you know, she's very pretty and she's the daughter of an earl and all that sort of thing. But actually, she had a very limited amount of opportunity. First of all, the circle of men that she was looking at was not that big. It wasn't like she could go down to the local bar in York, you know, and hope to pick up the nearest guy. You know, she had a very approved list that her grandmother was going through, and there weren't very many of the right men at the right time. So it was, you know, it's reasonable that it would have taken her a while, I think. And it's more interesting for you to watch.
I just wanted to mention to everybody right before the question that Dan Stevens is currently on Broadway now in The Heiress, and he's very good, and he'll be there till January. We just saw it last week. Okay, the question I have is, where did your brother get Downton as the name of it? Because everybody here pronounces it downtown.
Downtown. Yeah, like, I know. I don't know. I think the only thing I know about it is that there are several Downtons in Britain. So I think he had to find somewhere that people wouldn't immediately make not that you would ever expect this when you're writing something, like you're going to write something that everyone's going to make pilgrimages to in a few years. But I think you do have to kind of have a bit of foresight, to make sure that you don't set yourself up for anything like that. So I don't know whether it's a play on up, down.
They've had jokes on TV.
Yeah.
You're watching too much PBS. They say Downton instead of downtown when they meant to say that. It's funny.
But I do like the play on it, the upstairs Downton kind of, Count Downton, before the show begins, all the rest of it. Love all that.
My question is, season 3 is supposed to be in the 1920s. Are we going to see any flappers? Or any mention of the Jazz Age and Harlem and that sort of thing?
We sort of start to get into it, but I mean, things like the Charleston didn't begin until 1926, and the flappers are not until the later 1920s. So we begin to see something of the sort of bright young people influence of that time, but it was still pretty early doors for all that in 1920-21. Is that it? Got one more.
One is on an economic side. Earlier you alluded to the fact that essentially a lot of land-rich, title-rich, they would kind of marry American wealth. And some of that wealth was invested in railroad. Over the course of the 20s and the late 20s, and maybe this is more of a season 4 type of plot line, does the destruction of wealth in the late 20s, how does that impact essentially the Downton?
Well, probably in the late 20s, certainly that probably is more of a season 4 or 5, even late 20s, if we get that far. But no, we will see. I think it's an unavoidable fact, that was happening. So it will impact, But I mean, a lot of families did still manage to hold on to those houses. They're not paying mortgages on them or rent, So if you just sort of lived in one small corner, you could kind of keep on going. I mean, it did always make me laugh, that you get these very upper class families, and they all live in these tiny. They live in their kitchens pretty much, That's as much as you can afford to heat.
I'm going to borrow your microphone from you. Another point here is that in terms of the money, one of the striking things is that the families who did not have American money, where the aristocrats didn't have to go shopping for an American heiress, tended to be the families that had mineral rights, that had railroads running across their land, or that owned vast tracts of central London. They had big other income streams besides agricultural, and they often did quite well into the 20s and 30s. And then I think the divide gets sharper and sharper as the economy sort of collapses. And a lot of the big houses do just get plowed under or are left to fall apart. And that happens, as Jessica said earlier, approaching World War II and afterward. And they're just, there are books that they're full of the disappeared houses.
I mean, you also got new money coming in at that time, which is, you got the newspaper tycoons and the Industrial Revolution sort of people. Sorry, brewers, exactly. So they actually were very keen to take on the sort of mantles of success, so they wanted the big house in the country to show that they'd really made it. So they were the ones who often bought these houses and then kept that life going. They kind of hired the footmen and the butlers and things. And it was only really in the Second World War when a lot of those houses were taken over by the army, and the money just completely went, and they couldn't understand how they could ever make that work again. So they just, lots of them just knocked buildings down because they couldn't see a way of making it work. So that's what ended it.
And sorry, one other question. And while everything seems painstakingly loyal to the period, are there any storylines or plots that almost are too far-fetched for the period, such as Sybil with the chauffeur? Like, to me, that would seem
that was incredibly. I mean, that was actually based on an Earl's daughter who ran off with a groom that Julian heard about. But funnily enough, where that happened a lot was in America. And there's a lot of stories, and the reason I think Cora is quite circumspect about Sybil running off with Branson is not because she's as worried about the whole kind of aristocratic thing, because that's not where she comes from, but she would have heard from her mother of a lot of stories of very grand American daughters running off with their drivers and whatever, that all ended in divorce. Carol.
There's a wonderful story actually about a woman who was yes, in fact, she was, I believe, the great-grandmother of Princess Diana. And if I'm not mistaken, the first marriage fell apart, and then she ran off with the Hungarian horse trainer. So she was back in the U.S. by that point. So Jessica's exactly right. These things did happen, and it was always a huge splash. The papers had a heyday, and you can see a lot of evidence of that kind of thing. Because the lines are a little more permeable here, and because we don't have a servant class, so it has to go both ways. The servants have to be willing to look up as well as the girls to look down, and that happened more readily here.
But I think again, it sort of brings back that point you were asking me about before. These things did happen. People were as complicated, emotions were as messy then as they are now. As much as they were supposed to know that was their place. Of course, love doesn't always feel like that, doesn't always recognise that. So it was, as messy and as difficult for them occasionally too as it is for us now.
Hi. Can you tell us anything about plot lines or characters that may have gotten cut somewhere along the way? Just
of what? Sorry, of
plot lines or characters or anything that got cut along the way that you think is interesting and just didn't make it into the final show.
No, I don't know. Actually, what's been remarkable about it is that when Julian was approached by the executive producer Gareth Neame. And they went out for dinner, and Gareth said, Gareth was already a successful television producer, and he said to Julian that he could see scope for a TV series that was in the Gosford Park territory, where you looked at both above stairs and below stairs and gave them sort of equal weight, and that if you had a whole TV series to explore all of those characters, that would really work. And Julian said, well, that's very nice, but to go back to Gosford Park territory is a bit like asking lightning to strike twice, because he won the Oscar for Gosford. That was what turned his life around. Anyway, he went home, he happened to be reading Carol's book, To Marry an English Lord, and he read in it the story of Mary Leiter, who was a sort of beauty, but she didn't do terribly well. And then she had this day where she met a Duchess, the Prince of Wales, and a former Prime Minister in one day. And then she went to a ball wearing the most wonderful gown, and the Prince of Wales asked her for his first dance, and after that she was maid, and then she ended up dying the highest ranking American in history as Viceroy of India. Anyway, Julian was kind of thinking about her and thinking, what would it be like to come from Virginia and marry into this family, and it's all very exciting and everything, but then 20 years later you find yourself in this freezing cold house in Yorkshire, and that was Cora, and so she was the beginning of it all. Anyway, so he wrote that down, and he wrote this original treatment down with everybody in it, kind of down to Carson and Daisy, and took it to Gareth, and he took it to ITV. And he said remarkably little kind of changed, So, I've been to the early read-throughs, and sometimes a line or two is missing, but nothing substantial. So it's
pretty amazing. Let's do one more question.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about the character of Matthew a little bit, only because I think people sometimes try to see him as like a really improbable figure. Like, of course, he gets his inheritance, and then what happens in season 2 with miraculous cures, he gets, comes back from missing in action, the heir with the mummy face disappears. So it seems like a lot of improbable things happen, and my reading of that is that it's not just silly writing. I think everything Julian's doing is for a purpose, and so I'm wondering, is Matthew supposed to be like the fairy tale character, like this sort of magical, charming guy, and like, I don't know, I feel like that's maybe the point of it, that all that stuff happens, not that it's just like bad plotting.
I think Julian's always liked he likes good-looking leads, you know. He's quite funny about he was an actor for a long time, and he said he always was quite contented with the fact that he was a character actor, you know, because he said, when I go to the movies, I want to watch beautiful people on screen, you know. So I think he's quite happy to have Matthew as a sort of fairy tale, good-looking guy. But again, you know, yes, I mean, a lot happens to him because in a drama series, particularly one that's gone over 3 series, you know, your characters have to go through a lot, you know, because otherwise we just sort of change all the characters all the time. But it's remarkable. I mean, the things like, you know, with the legs, you know, the legs coming back and stuff. I mean, I was doing a talk, and the man in the audience sort of said, you know, this happened to his grandfather, who had a misdiagnosed thing. And this medical issues and things, I think, you know, they all were happening there. So yeah, probably maybe a lot is asked of Matthew. But he's our hero in it. I think he arrives as this underdog, and he will be taking over the Downton Abbey world.
He gets cuter too.
He gets what? Sorry?
Matthew gets cuter. Did you notice?
Gets cuter? Well, he gets more. My mother-in-law had a huge crush on him, which is hilarious. You know, so I would have to give her Dan Stevens details when I see him, but I see her. But she said, yes, he's very sort of magisterial, doesn't he, in the 3rd series? So if you like him, you'll enjoy even more.
Or maybe one more. Let's throw one more.
Maybe one more.
You guys have one.
You want to do now?
Well, I was a little confused about one character. Maybe I'll have to see. The one that came back from the Titanic. The one that came out from the Titanic that said he lived and he was walking with Edith and he seems to know a lot. And all of a sudden he disappeared quickly. What happened with that?
Because we're not supposed to know really who he was. You know, was he Patrick or was he? I can't remember what the possible other name was, Paul or something. But he signs his note P. Crawley, so we don't know if he was real or if he was a con man. That was just
because he would be the one who gets the inheritance.
Well, you know, you never know. Maybe he'll come. You know, he could still come back.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Well, shall we draw to a close?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.